Gaia euskarari buruz denez, lehenengo hitzak hizkuntza honetan egitea pentsatu dugu. Aurkezpen honek ziklo berri bat irekiko du Oñati communityn, non ikasle horiek doktoretzaren defentsa prestatzeko aurkezpena egingo duten. Ideia da gure sarea erabiltzea ezagutzak trukatzeko, eta gure komunitateko kidei defentsaren aurretik laguntzeko. So we welcome you to the talk on the Basque language, education and media given by Intza Palatin Mariscal. She is a former master student at the Oñati International Institute for the Sociology of Law, and she will be presenting on her PhD research topic. Intza is a PhD candidate at the European University Institute in Florence, and her PhD defense will happen in February next month. This presentation will inaugurate a new series at the Oñati community, where former students will present in preparation for the PhD defense. In the case of Intza, she is not only a former master student, she is also an active member of the Oñati community team, and we really appreciate her involvement. The Oñati community brings together alumni, faculty, and friends of the Oñati Institute and wish to be connected and networked for all kinds of academic success initiatives and social activities, such as joint project, social parallel gatherings around academic events, organizing future events, webinars. We are, of course, very happy to support them. We have a dynamic platform for all this, oñati.community, with blog posts, our useful corner on grants and jobs, information on Basque culture. So we invite all of you to join us. Till now, we have had successful webinars on poverty, pandemic, protests, and policing in the Global South, later followed by a webinar on the socio-legal implications of the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa, conflict and its impact on security and development in the case of Afghanistan, the discussion if the prison abolition has a chance, or how to handbook the sociology of law. All these discussions have been uploaded to a new YouTube channel. So, Intza, nahi duzunean, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Susana, and thank you everyone who joined me today. Arratsaldeon ta eskerrik asko etorri zareten guztioi. It's a pleasure to be presenting in front of this community, and I have seen very nice and familiar faces, so thank you. I wanted to start by maybe explaining who I am, because this really tells you a lot about my topic or why I chose to do things this way. So for those who don't know me, I am Intza Palatin Mariscal, and I was born in the French Basque country, the northern Basque country. Basque is spoken in both sides, on the French side and the Spanish side. And I was lucky enough that I grew up speaking 3 languages, the 3 official languages that are in the Basque territory, French, Spanish, and Basque. And I grew up in the border, and I have always been very curious. I come from a household that really encourages curiosity. And growing up, I already had all these questions about why is it this way in this side of the border? Why is it this way on the other side? And the curiosity about language always was there for me. So fast forward, I studied law in Bayonne, in the French Basque country, and I enjoyed studying law, but I had so many questions, and so many questions that were kept unanswered. Because while I was seeing and studying law in the books, I came from very traditional legal education, where you mainly and only study law in books, and my reality and what I was learning were different. So I kept wondering about this gap, the famous socio-legal gap. And after I graduated, I went to Oñati, and this is where I realized I had these questions that were mainly socio-legal. And this is where I learned about the tools, that can help you answer those questions, right? Also, once I was there, I learned that I enjoyed research, and I researched on the transborder cooperation, and in this case, one of the Basque associative schools, Ikastolen Elkartea, so a very interesting topic. But already I knew I wanted to study something on the Basque language, which is the language that unifies the three territories. And I didn't know where. And the scientific director at that time, Adam Charnota, talked me about these European university institutes that looked very interesting, a great place to be. And this is where I got accepted and where I have been doing my research. So once you know a bit of my background, now you might understand more about my topic. So the Basque language, right? And I was interested in answering the question on how the Basque language is regulated by law in the three Basque administrations. So that's important because I take into account 2 administrations in Spain and 1 administration in France. And also, what is the relationship between this legal framework and the Basque society? Well, that's already a big question, and I had to narrow it down. So I had to move from the big question of the relationship with society to 2 areas of social life, education and media. So this is what I have been doing. So already with the legal framework of the Basque language, we are talking about a comparative study because we have 2 nation states, France and Spain, with very different legal cultures and a different approach towards minorities and minority languages. And also 3 administrations, 1 being in Spain, 1 being in France and 2 being in Spain. And also between these 2 administrations, so the Basque Autonomous Community of Euskadi and Navarre, we see differences towards the Basque language and its regulation. I don't want this to be very long, so I will jump right into the conclusions of my research or what I've learned from my research. But feel free to ask me any questions about my dissertations or my research or any of the examples. So as I said, I needed to do this comparative analysis, right, between France and Spain. And already it is important to know that despite both countries being member states of the EU, then they have different levels of protection of regional languages. France has not ratified the European Charter of Regional or Minority Languages, whereas Spain has, for instance. And also we see a disparity of levels of protections when we look into the international law and the reservation that France usually has listed this. But anyways, I mainly needed to focus on the national legal frameworks and also the 3 administrations. In the case of Spain, despite having the same national legal framework, both Euskadi and Navarre have a different approach to the Basque language, leading to drastic differences. The main things that I've learned from this research, firstly, the importance of examining law in its context. Well, I am among socio-legal scholars mainly here, so this is no news for you. But yes, it is essential, especially when you are talking about a minority or a minority language. Because I needed to look beyond the non-recognition of co-officiality in France or the non-recognition of full co-officiality in Navarre, because it's scaled in different parts of the territory. Why? Because it helps us tell the story of the Basque minority language. If we don't look beyond black letter law, we don't see reality. And also by definition, being a minority, you are mainly not part of the big legal conversation that the majority has, and they are the ones, you know, passing laws, etc. So I needed to look beyond black letter law in order to tell the whole story. I used a core mix distinction between norm user and norm giver. This really helped me explain what is going on, which is a lot. Yes, also the teamwork and tension between norm users and norm givers. And I was happy to see some teamwork as well. We tend to focus on the bad and the tension between the norm and giver, norm user, but the teamwork also was very encouraging. So by examining the legal framework of the Basque language, we better understand the reality of Basque speakers. And then we understand better their claims and the different practices and dynamics that they put into place. And this also is very interesting when we compare both sides of the border, because the legal frames really sets the scene for what is really happening later on in society. In the Spanish side, Article 3 of the Constitution claims and give officiality to Spanish and also to other co-official languages inside the autonomous communities. And what I learned from the research is that talking or working on linguistic rights in Navarre looks a lot like juggling. It's a society that is very polarized, and notably on the linguistic matters, and dividing the territory between Basque-speaking mixed areas and non-Basque speaking, where you actually have Basque speakers, makes things very difficult, especially in the so-called non-Basque speaking area, where, well, these communities really have difficulties to access media and the language, education and the language, administration and the language, etc., etc. So yes, I learned that. I learned that you need to juggle a lot and go back and forth. And this is also what civil society has done. I remember one of the examples I had studied is the case of Euskal Herria Irratia, which is a radio station that was broadcasting in Basque in the mixed area. And they had to fight 15 years and reach the highest court so that the administration would actually implement and the rules and give them the permission to be broadcasting legally, for example. So even when the law gives you reason, it doesn't mean your language rights are applied. So in this case, we saw the tension with the norm user, norm giver, and not teamwork. But there are also moments where we have seen some teamwork. So this is one of these examples that was very telling. Also in the so-called non-Basque speaking area, we see that civil society filled the gap of providing for immersive education in Basque to the children, right? These parents decided on creating these private schools that were offering immersive education because they couldn't access it in the public realm, right? So all these dynamics. Then when still in the Spanish legal framework, when we look into the autonomous community of the Basque country, we see a different approach to linguistic rights of the Basque speakers. This administration took this proactive approach, aspiring to fully grant co-officiality to the Basque language. So they put Spanish together with Basque as co-official languages. But at the same time, they were aware that, well, the languages had different weight, and they proactively decided to work towards the realization of this full co-officiality. And I have seen this in education with programs and funding and the creation of different models where we have this even immersive model of education, right? And in media, where they heavily fund private Basque newspapers, or they create these public Basque TV and radio stations, etc. So we see this evolution over time. Some authors even say that this region, despite not being a state, acts as a kin state for the neighbors in France, because there are these agreements where institutions in the French side and in Euskadi, in the Spanish side, provide funding for projects and education and media in the French side that want to do it in Basque. So we really see this dynamic that was really nice to see. And it was also interesting for me to see how it worked out and how the legal framework really shaped what civil society was doing, what non-users were doing. And if we cross the border and we go back to France, well, the legal system and the legal culture is different. France is really this central state, and Article 2 of the French Constitution claims or proclaims French as the language of the Republic. Actually, it must be said that it was the first time language was expressly written in a French constitution, and happened in 1992. Later on, they added another article that included regional languages as part of the heritage of France, but we saw later in case law that this was actually void of any potential rights for the regional language speakers. When I actually started my PhD, just when I started, for the first time also in 2017, there was the first administrative entity that was created for the French Basque Country. So of course, it's not as administration in the French side, where we have this system of devolution of powers and a regional parliament, etc. But it's an institution that nevertheless has the merit of existing, and despite its limitation, has been doing some work here and there. So it was also nice to see its evolution, working together with other institutions in France or with its neighbors. So another thing I have seen, and that has been really, well, it was not eye-opening for me because it's something I expected, but it's nice to see when something is happening the way you think it's happening, right? That your hypothesis is confirmed. We see a lot of bottom-up dynamics that happen in the French side, because the Basque speakers, the community of speakers, needed to fill the gap. The expectations that speakers had of the norm of the legal framework were not met. And this is where you see the creativity that starts, and you see these dynamics happening. I was actually curious to see, and it surprised me, that norm users, so speakers, associations, the community, actually influence the law in books. I knew there was an interrelation, but I realized in the case of the Basque language, they have a lot of power, which is encouraging to see. For example, and I really like this example, parents' choice is really important. In this case, the non-users were the parents, or are the parents. They are the ones choosing to which schooling system they were then choosing to go. So the norms gives you a choice. It gives you the choice of monolingual schooling system, in the case of France, in Euskadi, you mainly can study in Spanish, but then you have to learn Basque anyways, it's the model A, or you can send your children to a bilingual system or to the immersive system. And this already shapes a bit the norm, because the more you have a demand for the immersive schooling system, the more the policymakers will fund the immersive schooling system, and there is this ripple effect. Or in the cases, so in some places of Navarre or in the French side, where immersive schooling system is provided in the private sector by these private schools and associative schools, over time created the inclusion of some, they are called experiments, immersive experiments in the French public schooling system. So when you show this demand, then little by little, it takes time, you see the effects later on. But still, the normative effect, the normative framework is fundamental, because the norm really sets what can and cannot be done, and also sets in which ways you can actually do things, or to what extent you can be creative. In the end, the norm has its place, but lucky enough, I was doing my PhD in a law department. I do have 10 minutes, so I will try to keep moving forward. Another thing I have in my PhD, and this is maybe the most innovative or provocative proposal, depending on how you are looking at it. I analyzed the linguistic side of the right of freedom of expression. By studying media, I had to study freedom of expression. And by analyzing a few cases, and also the case of this Basque newspaper that was closed down, this Egunkaria case, I realized that if we look into freedom of expression through the linguistic lens, we have these negative and positive aspects. In this scenario, the negative aspect of this linguistic element of freedom of expression would be the minimum for the fulfillment of freedom of expression for a minority language speaker, meaning the right to use one's language. So in this case, in France, I will have this negative aspect of the right of freedom of expression fulfilled, because, well, I have the right to use my language, right? And then why not a positive aspect of freedom of expression, a more comprehensive approach. This is what the administration of Euskadi will be making. So they're not only allowing, which is a fundamental right of this expression in your language, but they will also enable and help platforms where you could do that by creating television broadcasting in Basque. You will help achieve this more comprehensive right. But this is more of a, I don't know if it's a provocation or an innovative proposal, but this is the side of my research. And finally, and maybe to wrap everything up before the Q&A session, the trans-border cooperation has been also part of this research. I didn't look into it as an entity standing alone, but I stumble upon it every time I was looking at something. And I see trans-border cooperation being increasingly happening in this region, which is encouraging as a border baby myself. But in the case of the language, I was pleased to see that it's getting there. It's increasingly happening, and we see the three administrations working towards the same goal of including the Basque language firstly, and improving the numbers of speakers, and also helping with collaboration of projects or improving the pre-existing collaboration. For instance, the example of the associative schools I told you about, the ones that parents created in the 60s, Ikastola schools. So these were schools created in the 60s, both in the French side and the Spanish side. And these schools were created before in Spain. You had the right to study in Basque, well, because of the dictatorship, right? But these schools evolved, but they are still here. And they work in a transborder fashion as well. So this is a success story, but then we have plenty of other ones relating to the Basque language. What I have seen is that more and more we have this not some civil society oriented cooperation, but more and more administrations and institutions are taking into account this language. They're seeing that it's worth an effort, and it's worth this collaboration. And this is encouraging from a new perspective, or at least for my generation that feels that is also an EU citizen, seeing that the border, it's slowly, not really fading, but it's letting some light in that you can see across the other side more easily, and yes, and this is really helping the language. Finally, I have a few minutes before we can continue. Lastly, I just wanted to mention that the latest addition to my dissertation, because when I was to more or less finish on the French legal framework and education, we had this new bill that was adopted on the heritage or regional languages and heritage of France. That came up as a surprise. I think most of the French citizens were surprised that this law was adopted. It did show that a big part of the French society wants these languages to be more protected or their rights to be enhanced. The other side of that is the decision of May from the Constitutional Council, actually sanctioning a few articles of this law, but it shows that it's a current topic and it's not going anywhere, and that there is a big support also from the French citizen. These have been a few points of my research overall. I hope you did get something. And of course, I am really happy to go more into detail about anything I mentioned, or if you have any other questions about my research or topic, please feel free to ask any of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Insa, for your presentation. I think that your topic is very current and important. For me, living here as a foreigner, it's quite shocking to get to understand all these topics around language, because that never happens in my country. We speak Spanish and that's it. But being here, it brings your attention to the difficulty of trying to speak your own language in your own country, but not being allowed to do it so often. And I would like to ask the people that is joining us to start their cameras and come and ask some questions. It's going to be a very, very fun, interactive presentation.